the more I understood what was not regulated in the pet world, the more I was blown away to find what was not regulated in human consumer products in the United States.
Thanks for watching Hot Flashes and Cool Topics podcast. Be sure to subscribe and ring that bell to catch all of our conversations. Now, on to the show.
Welcome back to Hot Flashes and Cool Topics. Get ready today, guys. We have an interesting conversation with Dr. Aly Cohen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, ladies.
Well, we want to start by saying congratulations. Your book launched yesterday, Detoxify, the everyday toxins harming your immune system and how to defend against them. So congratulations.
Thank you. It's like giving birth all over again. It's less anesthesia and, not a lot of pain. So we're good.
Well, this book truly is just full of information that, I actually had to read it over a period of a couple of days because I was trying to absorb as I went through, because it's wonderful, but it's very informative, and a lot of things will apply to the people who are reading it, and they have to go, okay, let me absorb that. So I thought we'd start at the beginning with with the four sections when you talk about assessing before you avoid, avoiding what before you add, and adding before you allow. And that helps kind of dissect the book into, edible bites, so to speak. So I thought we'd start at the very beginning with assess.
Yeah.
And the book, I always kid because Bridgett makes our guests cry a lot of the time with her questions. But you actually made me cry at the beginning of the book when you talk about your dog.
Yeah.
Why did that was such a sad story, but can you start talking about how your dog getting sick kind of led you into this whole area of practice?
Yeah, I'll start by saying that I would never be doing or sitting here doing this work if my golden retriever had actually lived to a normal, healthy life of 10, 11, 12, if you're lucky, right, with the golden. And so I start by saying that because I'm just so shocked to be here. But life takes many turns, right? You get, good things, bad things. This was sort of a hit to my heart. And I think that's why it sort of set out, created a mission. So long story short, when I was a young mom, this was 15 years ago. My oldest is 17 now. No, 18. Oh, geez, he just turned 18. God, I'm aging quickly. Anyway, when I had two little kids, they were 2 and 6 months, or 2.5 and 6 months, and we had a golden retriever, was our first child, and it was sort of like the practice baby, and so he was about 4.5 years of age when I was a young mom, and we got sick, like Goldens. We thought like he swallowed a sock or he ate something, and it would just come right out the other end, and we'd be like, okay, let's keep going. But he wasn't getting better, and we just couldn't understand why he was panting and all these other things. So we ended up going to a couple different vets to get opinions. And long story short, he was diagnosed with something that's so unusual for dogs, but particularly even golden retrievers, called autoimmune hepatitis, which is something you might have heard of in humans, right? It's an autoimmune disease where the body's immune system basically doesn't recognize its liver in this case, and the immune system sort of attacks the liver, not knowing it's own liver. And so it's an autoimmune disease of the liver. And when we diagnosed him, he had a liver the size of a golf ball. I mean, it was just unsustainable. And so it had been chronic. And, what was so shocking, because this is like, what? Is that, when I started to really, I was heartbroken. I started to look at what he was eating, what he was drinking. Did he had contaminated, food, dog food? At that time, they had some melamine in dog food at the time. It was a big scare on the news. We thought about his drinking water. We live in New Jersey with, all farmland. So I thought, okay, maybe there's like a crack in the pipe and we're all going to be, in trouble. Long story shorter, again, the more I looked into his life, the more I looked into things that were affecting his body. Flea and tick collars, the toy he sucked on, that's plastic. I was essentially doing an environmental health survey now that I look back, which I now have in the book. But at that time, I was doing it just to learn how I could fix this dog and maybe protect our family. And so the more I understood what was not regulated in the pet world, the more I was blown away to find what was not regulated in human consumer products in the United States. And it was such an awakening, and I had to keep on learning, keep on learning. At one point I was going to do a local lecture because I just wanted to educate people what I was learning. And I reached out to Environmental Working Group, EWG.org. You probably have heard of them. They do the Dirty Dozen, Clean 15. And at that time, that was one of my main sources of understanding of anything. And then I started working with them. And so it took on a life of its own just out of sheer sadness and curiosity. And quite frankly, I was very angry because I was a practicing physician, new at a fellowship for rheumatology, dealing with autoimmune diseases in humans. And I had never heard how much of our environment affects human health. So, it was really quite a journey for the last 15 years or so.
Yeah, that was so shocking in there when you shared how things just aren't, they're let go. Like certain things with the EPA, it's just let go. Like, well, these were grandfathered in, or these. Can you share a little bit about how that was really shocking?
Yeah, I mean, we've had over the years since 1938 was really when the first law came into effect about, with cosmetics, for instance, and personal care products, because a group of women who had started using a company for their mascara called Lash Lure, and it's really an interesting story, became blind because of the very long name of this dye that we actually still use a lot in our cosmetics, by the way. But it was close to the eyes and apparently created infection and some blindness. And so in 1938, there was a law that was passed. But it really was so weak that it didn't do much. Then fast forward 1958 was another set of laws that were sort of coming down the pike to really look at food and to see whether or not, generally regarded as safe or generally recognized as safe, which is kind of like the GRAS, they call it GRAS recognition, whether or not that would help with the food industry, even how, what could be allowed in food. Started off with just, GRAS things were like vinegar and salt and sugar. But eventually, when we started creating more synthetic compounds that go into all of our products and our food, the regulation wasn't covering those newly designed compounds. And so here we are now in 2025, we have over, I want to say 1,300 food additives that are allowable that have never been really studied for safety. We have, I think, 11,000 pesticides that go through very limited testing before they go into our surroundings in terms of farming. Proprietary blends, active versus inactive ingredients that don't have to be disclosed. And, we have cosmetics, personal care, all these products, nothing in the United States under legislation requires testing by manufacturers for those ingredients before they're put into products that go onto shelves. And that is really unique to our country. I mean, in other parts of the world, we have a little EU and European Union does a lot better job of this. They're not perfect, but they do a lot better job. Canada does a very good job. And of course, California in our country leads the way with Prop 65. But it's really a very difficult situation to get your head around when you think about it.
Now, you mentioned in the book that there's over 95,000 chemicals that are currently used in U.S. products.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found shocking was when it comes to chronic health conditions or autoimmune conditions, the majority of the autoimmune patients are women. What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, it's interesting because at this point, when we say majority, that's a fact for sure. Women tend to get, and that has a lot to do, and I talk about it in the book, our estrogen receptors and having a newly found exist gene that was just discovered for lupus patients. So we're still learning more about why in general, women have more risk of autoimmune diseases, but there are many of autoimmune diseases that are equal men and women. So type 1 diabetes, Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. And then there are some that are male dominant, which is like ankylosing spondylitis, for instance, psoriatic arthritis. So I want to make sure people realize that this is affecting all, genders in our population. And because that's so important because we have such a high number. So between 7 and 14% is estimated now as the number of US citizens that have at least one autoimmune disease. And that comes out to about 24 million people, 24 to 26 million. So the idea that we have such a large proportion of autoimmune disease patients, actually worldwide, but in general, it's an epidemic. It's actually growing over time. So the argument, has been made, oh, we're just getting better at diagnosing it. And that actually has flatly not been found to be true. In fact, if you think about the healthcare system, and I'm in it, I'm still seeing patients, but I left conventional, 15, 20 years of conventional practice where you have 15 minutes a patient, 30 minutes for a follow-up. You see 50 patients a day. It's like, blah, 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 blah. The odds of getting the right history, the amount of history we actually need to get really savvy at diagnosing, or at least, staying the same as we've always been, is never going to, it doesn't correlate with the numbers that we're seeing in terms of actual cases, new incidence cases. So, it's just one of those things where we have to really look and see, what are we surrounded by? What are we eating? What are we absorbing through our skin, our personal care products, our feminine care products with young women? We often, kind of write that off as no biggie, but it is a biggie. And then kind of think how it correlates with the rise in the number of synthetic compounds, primarily from World War II, is where we had this huge, huge load of synthetic chemicals that really came out. We think of Monsanto, but there was hundreds of other companies that were coming out with compounds for pesticides and rayon, naugahyde, formica. I mean, we all recognize this from childhood, right? But we still have plexiglass as, for fighter pilots. These are things that made aircraft lighter. We had pesticides to fight overseas to not get sick. So again, there was a lot of design that was made at that time that now plays into what we're exposed to and can't get the genie back in the bottle.
Right. And you also talk about different testing, that the urine test and what people have in them. Can you address like the testing we need and what they're finding in most people's urine tests?
Yeah. So the way some of these chemicals are tested, and by the way, 95,000 is just a kind of a ballpark. I mean, obviously no one's going to hang their hat on that, but we now know just from registries of different groups of industries and what they list as their compounds within, but it's a lot. And mind you, we haven't had this exposure to this many chemicals in our whole existence. If you think about evolution, it's been more or less 4 or 5 million years. This has all been in the last 75 years. So it's a very short period of time to have this much exposure over time. And it does make its way into our body. So some of these chemicals are tested through blood. Some of them are tested best through urine. Some are even tested, as we know, through breast milk, spinal fluid. I mean, we've had ways to look at all of these fluids. And, the idea, obviously, urine is least invasive. It's usually the best way to test children. It's usually the best way to test large populations because you don't need phlebotomy and all that. But it's the idea that we are all pretty much filled with chemicals of one degree or another, one type or another. And at any given time, it could vary because some of these chemicals break down relatively fast, like bisphenol A. We've heard of BPA in baby bottles being removed in 2012. Well, that's wonderful. That was a huge win. But if BPA was bad enough to take out of plastic baby bottles for babies because of its endocrine disrupting capability, its ability to affect hormones, we're still not where we need to be, where we remove it from other sources like canned foods. So there's a little hypocrisy here, and there's also substitutions that have came into play. But look, I am not a huge fan, having been doing this a very long time, having been scared out of my mind in the beginning, like anyone else would be, and working my way through real life scenarios of life, of motherhood, of busy working life. My kids play sports on, synthetic turf, which I could just spend an hour on. Life is life. And so when it comes to testing, and being very cost conscious, which, I think is important to think about with patients, I don't think testing is always the best choice because you can just assume you've got chemicals. The question is, well, what do you do about it anyway? Put money into the solution. So that's where a lot of my work comes from, is just more solution based than anything else.
Before we get to the solutions, and we're definitely going to talk about those, could you explain the difference or the application for endocrine disrupting chemicals and immune disrupting chemicals?
Great question. So what's so interesting is that a very brave group of researchers, academic researchers, about 25, 30 years ago, discovered that many chemicals, at least at the time, they were looking at bisphenol A. Okay, so my co-author for 2 previous books were published. Actually, I have one here. Were published by in Fred von Saal is the world-renowned guy on BPA, and he and I partnered up, which was a great story in and of itself. But needless to say, we worked on a textbook where he pulled in all of his best research colleagues from around the world to create a textbook. And then this was a consumer book through Oxford. And then, the idea is that back in that 25-year period, a very interesting experiment turned out that, and I'm going to simplify it, but it was a mouse study that one of the researchers discovered came out incorrectly. And the reason it came out correctly was because the mice were drinking water from a plastic water bottle. So it threw off the results to the point where they had to keep repeating it and figuring out why. And they traced this anomaly in the results to the fact that the chemicals perhaps in the plastic where the mice were drinking from was affecting the results. And they didn't know why. So they did a deep dive and discovered that the plastic contaminant that they were looking at, bisphenol A, was in fact able to screw up the results and was repeatable. And they also came up with the findings that at very low dose exposures, the lowest dose that you could even imagine, parts per million, parts per trillion, they were actually able to show that you could have physiologic changes in these mice similar to what you might see at larger dose exposures. So the classic toxicology paradigm that the dose makes the poison, where it's like linear, right? The more you get exposed, the more you have a physiologic change. I always think of my 21st birthday, but you know what I'm saying? Like, basically the more you drink, the more sick you get, the more whatever. This threw that on its head. And it turned out it was like a U curve or a curve like this. It's called non-monotonic or this. And what that means on a graph for, many people who might be challenged like myself is basically that you have these low doses that have the same effect and are missed because people are only researching the higher doses. And so when they discovered this, it was such an eye-opening phenomenon. And it's similar to the way hormones work. So hormones, and this is why it's called endocrine disrupting chemicals, before I get into immune disrupting, is hormones work very similarly. Over evolution, hormones are the signalers. They're the things that get done. You know what I mean? They basically make you grow. They make you have fertility, capability. They make brains develop into even male and female. They make body organs in utero go into male or female. They strengthen bone, right? I'm a rheumatologist. They strengthen bone. They build bone. So all of these hormones, insulin is a hormone, right? That makes us utilize sugar properly. Thyroid hormone, that makes our metabolism work properly, right? So all of these hormones that are so critical to human physiology only require a teensy tiny amount to do their job. And that's what we called conservation of energy through evolution, so that we don't need to expand a lot of energy to get done, right? What was discovered about BPA was that it worked similar to low dose estrogen. That was their first finding, that it mimics estrogen and it can affect the receptors similar to estrogen. So it could basically like fight out real estrogen by being a fake.
Really?
And make changes physiologically. And what's so brilliant, because I interviewed Pete Myers, who was one of the forefathers of this area. I said, it was so brilliant that you said the word disruption, because disruption opened up 20 years of research that could be characterized as disruption, not elevation, decrease. It was just such an open-minded way to describe what they were finding, because they knew there was a disruption, but they didn't know which way to go. Like, was it inflammation or anti-inflammation? Was it high or low? And since that time, there's now been so many more studies. I mean, robust studies from around the world. The Endocrine Society supports this research. The American College of Reproductive Medicine, ACOG, American College of Obstetricians, Gynecologists, all have position statements on how these environmental chemicals, of course, they're all very different in the way but have effects on human health and reproduction and puberty and all of these things that affect what we're seeing, clinically. So essentially, that was where endocrine disrupting chemicals came about. And since 25 years ago, there's now 1,000 formally diagnosed as or discovered to be endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDCs. What was found along the way was also immune system effects. So no one's ever called them immune disrupting chemicals. But I said to Fred, who's my co-author, said, I don't understand why we're not framing this to correlate with the association of an autoimmune phenomenon when we see so much data. He goes, not only is this true, and not only should it be written and talked about and framed and acronym given, but you should do it. And if he had not said that, I would not be doing this. But he was the one who said, because of your background in rheumatology and what you're seeing clinically. So I've just been calling immune disrupting chemicals, but we describe them. They're described in the literature, but not so much with the acronym per se. It's just more of a way for people who are affected by these conditions to really grab hold of the idea.
You also address times in people's lives when these can really make a difference. Can you talk about those times in people's lives when this really can wreak havoc?
Yeah, and it's not to scare your audience. I mean, I'm really trying to, give the good information on the why you should care without overdoing it so that you get restrictive and you say, forget it, throw up your hands. But I want to give just enough to say why so that you can do the what. That's really the goal. The vulnerable periods of human development is what you're alluding to, which I love. So these have been discovered by many of these same researchers that study teenagers and children and in utero exposures, pregnant women, and even menopausal women. That these are the periods during human development where hormones are increasing and decreasing. They're building up, like my teenagers, God help us all, and broken down, right? And we think of menopause as where we just shut off our hormones. That's not true. They're very active, actually. They're just reorganizing. And so one of the things that's really interesting is that when we talk about exposures to chemicals, I speak to high school students, I teach. I'm working to get this into high schools nationally as a part of their health and their health curriculum. It's a heavy lift, but I'm working on it still. The idea is that there are different periods of development where, because hormones are so volatile, that these exposures may have more of a physiologic effect, may have effect on gene expression, may have an effect on disease development or not. And so that's kind of the call out as to not only is this a problem, but maybe we should be paying a little bit more attention to certain times during development. And I agree, but I don't want people to think like regret or, oh my God. And, this is about moving forward.
Right. You make that clear in the book too, that, like here I am 50, how old am I? 57. And I'm like, well, okay, it doesn't mean I'm just going to give up. I'm going to try to implement some things that'll make things safer.
And
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
really clear in your second section.
Yeah.
I just want to follow up on that. I think that's really clear in your section on avoidance, because you start with what's in your water, what's in your food, and processed foods. And those are kind of the touchstones where people go, this is too much. I can't absorb all this information. But you make it very clear in what you're saying about you don't need to avoid everything, but there are resources out there.
Right.
Like the Dirty Dozen and things like that. So can you talk about that section and why it was important for you to not go, okay, just throw everything out and start again?
Yeah, because I was going back to sort of health coaching 101, where, you have to meet your audience where they are, whether it's a patient, whether it's your teenager, wherever. My teenagers don't listen to me half the time or more. You have to meet them where they're at so that you can get into their heart and soul to make change. Change is not easy for anybody. But when I thought about the 4A's and to simplify how I teach, I mean, I'm teaching doctors now, and a lot of them don't know, at least in the program that I'm teaching in, that, this is not still in our curriculum, or high school or seventh graders. It's all the same sort of learning process. The assess is really important because you want to know what you're up against. You kind of want to know where sources are. You kind of want to know, well, okay, that makes sense. Now I know where things are coming from potentially. Let me start with that piece of data. The second section, avoid, and I say avoid kind of and swap, because I don't want people to think it's all or nothing. It's black and white. Okay, you can't wear mascara because there's 2 chemicals in there that are supposed to be harmful. No, there's companies that do better. And you can, and I give resources for those that do better. Or if you want to make your personal care products, we have do it yourself, make your own, very simple. Or you could look up the proper or the useful apps and websites that kind of do this work for you. So the idea is avoiding is really where you're starting to take action, where you're starting to remove the triggers from your body's exposure. And that if you choose to swap, you can do that too. I often think about cleaning products, for instance, when it comes to avoid. I'm like, why do we have 20 different cleaners for a kitchen? Like, why do we have like a sink cleaner, an oven cleaner, a surface cleaner, a window cleaner, a carpet cleaner? It's all marketing. It's all been keeping up with the Joneses. It's this huge marketing chemical machine when in fact they all really could be handled with one cleaner, like white vinegar and a little Castile soap, or lemon juice that's real, or sea salt for scrubbing. And I put that all in the book with these recipes. The idea is that we don't need to throw a hurricane towards something that's just a windstorm. It just makes no sense to me.
Yeah. And also, there was something in there I'd never heard before that you included in the book, and I may not be pronouncing it. Oh boy, it looks like the word obese, but
Obesogens.
obesogens.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, very sexy word. I'm sure we're all excited to hear about that. Obesogens. So obesogens were actually really interesting. They were discovered by within the same group of really brilliant researchers. Actually, Bruce Blumberg got a leg up on this as well. He's out of University of California. I'm not sure which one, but and he even wrote a book about it. But the idea is that obesogens were basically endocrine disrupting chemicals, so within that class, but they had a particularly cool function of affecting fat cells, and not in a good way. And so what obesogens were characterized as being able to sort of bind to receptors that make fat cells called adipocytes bigger, also able to take stem cells that is kind of like in the bone marrow, ossobuco, or whatever you want to call it, in our bones, right? That's where we make cells to begin with, making those stem cells into fat cells as opposed to, say, other more useful cells. So there was a lot of different mechanisms by which some of these chemicals, atrazine was one. I mean, that's a pesticide. Tributyltin is another that cleans the bottom of ships to get off all the things that stick to the bottom of ships. There's a lot of them. But the idea was that when they looked at them in animal studies, they could see that exposure, even successive generations, multiple generations later, had some of the gene changes from those original exposures. And so that's one of the concerns we see now with these chemicals with humans, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, and when you were talking about, you see it generations, and I'm looking at my notes right now thinking there were forever chemicals or forever things, and then there were some that go through generational. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, there's different ways to classify chemicals. Again, this is a big lift, so I wanted people to know that there are chemicals that we now know, take longer to break down. Forever chemicals, the perfluoralkyls. We know that there's ones that are designated by how they work. Are they stain guard? Are they nonstick chemicals? Then there's chemicals that are, labeled by what they hurt, right? Neurotoxin, liver toxin. So there's lots of different ways to categorize different chemicals. But I think what you're also talking about, not just the chemical itself, but also how some of them can affect your exposure at this moment in terms of methylation is a process by which it affects the proteins that sit on our genes. So our genes, let's step back a second. Genes don't typically just change, right? Genes are like, a blueprint to our bodies. We get them from our parents, and then we have our genes. But what's so interesting is that we have these proteins that sit within our genes. That's called our epigenome. Think above, right? And our epigenome is actually modifiable, not just by chemicals in a bad way, but by lifestyle and nutrition and lots of things that no one ever thought we had control over. You're also affecting those proteins. Those proteins are allowing those genes that could be good or bad to express or not. So we have this sort of control over gene expression, not whether or not we change our genes per se, but whether we express those genes or not. That's our epigenome. And that is remarkably important because it allows the number 3A to add. That's the 3A, the third A, right? We have assess, we have avoid or swap, which is taking away the problem as much as we can that's hitting our body. The add is really critical, is adding in certain components into our lifestyle and even into the nutrition that we consume that offset problems from these chemicals, interestingly enough. And so certain foods do this. Omega-3 fatty acids. We know vitamin B9, which is folic acid. We know the quercetin, which is similar to vitamin C. These are antioxidants, can really have a big effect on offsetting some risk from exposures. And wouldn't you know it, these are all basically whole foods, kind of plant-based nutrients that I try to get people to figure out how to do the best job of getting. But essentially, we have some superpowers in our choices. And even sleep, sleep is incredibly important to add in not just quantity, which we're all looking for, but really quality, because we're washing our brains and our spinal cord while we sleep. That's been really great science that's come up over the last 5 to 10 years. Exercise and sweating and using all of our physiology to our best, we're harnessing what we've been given. We just need to be able to do it in the mindset of not so much maybe losing weight or whatever, but maybe just detoxing, because it's just a really good way to do it. So that's the add component that I think is just so important to think about as well.
You also mentioned in the book you call them the 4 human fertilizer supplements, which I think, I really liked in the book. I'm the type of person where don't like telling me to avoid stuff is great, but you have to tell me what to put in. And
Yeah.
you're very specific with the foods. And I mean, you have a 21-day detox, a lot of resources in the book, which I appreciate, because I'm the type of person, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. But you talk about the 4 human fertilizer supplements that are really important. Can we break those down?
Sure. So those were really developed not just from my background in anthropology, which I love and I always tap into, but just seeing patients and seeing what comes through the office. And we know that we are deficient in so much nutrition that is sort of out of our control to some degree, because, we can eat a really clean diet with lots of fruits and vegetables, Mediterranean, which I talk about a lot, but not all of it has the same nutritional value because our food system is kind of screwed up, right? In modern day times, which is now, our food sits in a lot of low temperature freezers or refrigerators before they go to big box stores. And all of that time since being picked, it's losing nutritional value. So if it's organic, great, right? I promote that a lot. I talk about it. I talk about other ways to clean your produce and stuff like that, because you remove a lot of pesticides, which is a win, right? Only thing we have in really the food industry is organic, believe it or not, USDA organic. That's very very helpful. But what's interesting is that there's 2 components. There's what's on your food, and then what is its nutritional value? And how do you get a higher load of nutrition to do what I said, which is like offset problems, right? So I thought about all, the food system, and the soil often is not so nutritious anymore. There's people might have heard this, but we're sort of using up a lot of good nutrition in our soil. And, the time that food takes, I had blueberries, I think, from Peru a few months ago. And I thought, boy, I wonder how long it took to get my organic blueberries from Peru to my supermarket down the street. Unless you're growing your own food, which I applaud, unless you're really advocating for local farmers, which I applaud, and trying to eat, sooner from being picked, we're all sort of at the whim of the food system. And so from that understanding, I realized that when patients come through, they're deficient in vitamin D, which everyone seems to be, right? Modern day life. And we're deficient in certain nutrients, certainly iodine, which is very protective to the thyroid gland, which is a really great discussion in terms of how the thyroid gland has sort of led to an epidemic of thyroid conditions. And it's really, in many ways, a nutritional problem. And so all of the things that I was seeing deficient, I realized this has got to be the plan to suggest for people to fill in where we're missing. So the 4 things, sorry, long-winded answer, but the 4 things that I really stand by, and it couldn't be a lot more, but this is what I think is the simplest and is really, number 1, a really great multivitamin. And when I say a multivitamin, that's great. I mean, not your typical, the ones I grew up on, actually, but the ones without colors added, BHA, BHT preservatives, fillers. They have enough of what they're supposed to have in them, which is, for any layperson, how do they know, right? But that's how you have a third party testing type of brand, because the really good brands, and there's not that many of them, really rely on third party testing that's unbiased to tell the consumers that they really do have what's in there and the amount that they say they have in there. And a multi should really have iodine, at least 150 micrograms, which is not an outrageous amount. It's a very reasonable amount, but it's a daily amount of iodine, among other things that we need daily to keep our cells thriving, to keep our body and our physiology in good shape. And so the first was the multivitamin, and I give a bunch of information as to how you suss that out. The second thing, not in any particular order, is vitamin D, which many people have heard of before in terms of being low. Vitamin D3 is really what you get over the counter. And vitamin D3 is so critically important to the immune system. It's also good for heart disease prevention, vision, just a whole host of things that D is good for. And that's typically has to be a supplement because we're not getting enough in our food system, no matter how great a diet you have. The third is probiotic, and I go into the gut microbiome and why the gut is so critical to the immune system, largest immune organ, but that the microbes that we've been living with that line the interior of the gut, which is 26 feet of bowel, is really comprised, we hope, of really healthy bacteria. There's trillions of them, but we want the good ones. And so you're really taking a probiotic. If you're not eating probiotic foods, which I also talk about in the food, in the book, but that probiotic supplement is for the mere mortals like me who don't have time to cook or, don't get the right foods all the time. And then the last of the four fertilizer supplements that I talk about in depth is omega-3 fatty acids, which is like fish oil. But so much of it is junk because it's hard to source. And so I talk about how do you get a good brand? How do you kind of understand walking into any store, how to look at that label and understand it?
Right. And, some other things before we go that I really want to talk about. You did two things that were so simple to look for. Well, one of them was looking at the recycling on plastic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I see a number 7, nope. So can you talk about, how the different types, just some of the simple things like that, just as a start?
Yeah, well, I never understood, and maybe your audience didn't either. I didn't understand what the triangle with the number is on the bottom of a plastic container. And it's pretty much all plastics, right? But it's even the big blue carboys, that you see emptied out at, Lowe's and Home Depot and whatever, where people return them, or even on your, drinking water, Poland Spring, I don't know, whatever, all the delivery services. But it's also, applesauce containers. If you go into like Walmart or any food store, you could see literally 14 different types of applesauce containers. So the idea is that plastics have, interestingly enough, they were given designations of what those plastics are made of by an organization from the plastics recycling industry. So it was all started in, I think, 1988, where the plastics industry wanted to see if they can recoup money by recycling, putting these recycling codes so that they could basically get money back. So they were designating what those numbers were so they could make it easier. Well, I say, well, let's use that to our benefit as consumers, right? So now that we know science about what those plastic chemicals are, and we know actually which triangle and which number they might be in, we can guide our choices a little bit better. So there's the 1 through 7 designation. Anyone could look on Google or, search engine and say plastic recycling codes, and you'll get wonderful descriptions. We have it in the book. But the idea is that number 1 is PET, P-E-T-E, which is polyethylene terephthalate. 2 is another type of plastic. 3 is polyvinyl chloride. 4 is, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but then 5 is pretty much safer as well. I actually should open my book and actually give you the exact thing. But the idea is that 6 is styrene or polystyrene, which is carcinogenic, styrofoam. And 7 is typically bisphenol A. So when I tell people what to look for, I always say stick with 1, 2, 4, and 5. Stay away from 3, which is polyvinyl chloride. In general, not the greatest exposure either to eat, or technically to breathe in, but you have to weigh that out. And then 6 is styrofoam and 7 is BPA. And if you go practice this, like if you just go into a supermarket, you'll get it. It's pretty quick and pretty easy. And if you have choices, you can make those.
Yes, I remember 5, 4, 1, and 2. The rest are bad for you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
That's
little,
in the book.
Yes, it is. And I'm just trying to, because I really want to show this. And of course, I'm like scrambling to find it. And it's funny because I have it in the old book. And so now I'm like, oh, maybe I could just find it faster in my old book because it was there too. Here it is. No,
Okay,
which,
so those who are
Oh yeah,
watching the
yeah.
video,
Yes. And you have the diagrams. There's just
right? You
lots.
have all the triangles and break it
yeah.
down, which
So you can
is
basically see the types of products. Like, yeah, look, if it's your plastic laundry detergent, am I really going to tell you to swap that out? Like, who cares, right? But if it's going into your body, you might think about the drink or the food that has that triangle. And if you have a choice, then maybe do that. I mean, the goal is to kind of stay away from plastics as much as you can, but we live in the real world and it's really difficult to do that.
that's
Right.
so true. And I think also when you were talking about adding, you break that down too. You're like eat 2 to 5 cups of vegetables every day. Consume dandelions. That was a little bit of a shocker for me. Can we talk about why we should consume dandelions?
The thing is dandelions, which are just yellow flowers that we used to pick and do the
Right, and give to our parents
But wasn't
too.
there like, didn't you like go like this with your thumb and knocked
Oh,
off?
it gets all
Flick it.
yellow on you. Put
Yeah,
it
or
on
put it
Yeah.
you.
under.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that was another type of yellow. But anyway, long story short, we've had our fun as kids, or at least I did, with dandelions, and they were always considered a bad guy, and everyone wanted to mow them down. Well, it turns out they have some actually pretty interesting, detoxification properties. It's one of those things where I probably wouldn't necessarily go out in my backyard and do it because I know that we've been sprayed locally with different pesticides. So I think about that in terms of my exposures. But for most, other people who may see them, there are really easy ways to crush them down and to actually make them into all sorts of things. You can also find it as a capsule, from a good brand that does it and they're cheap, right? Because dandelions are everywhere. So I want people to have as much suggestions. As possible. There's also, NAC or N-acetylcysteine supplements that you can take, which are basically making your liver kind of turn up its natural enzymes to break down chemicals. NAC is pretty commonplace in supplement aisle. But I don't want people to always rely on supplements. Like I'm really saying those four fertilizer chemicals, supplements, because I really feel like those have the highest yield benefit for human health if they're done well. And that we may actually not be getting, even in the best diets, enough of what we need to stay healthy. So that's why it's just those four fertilizer ones, but brands matter too.
Right. And before we go, I wanted to just talk about water because you did spend a lot about water, filtration systems and the importance of that. And I love how you addressed, because my big question was, okay, so what about my refrigerator filter? And you answered it in there. But can you talk about just like why maybe getting a filtration system?
And which one is the best?
Which one is the best?
Yeah, no, this is really high yield. I like people to hear this because it took me 15 years to figure this out, and I'm happy to share. So let me just give you a couple quick fun facts because you need that to know the why and then the how. So in the United States, US population, 85% of the population is served by wastewater treatment plants for their drinking water. Okay, wastewater treatment plants are just these big plants that funnel lake water, streams, sewage, runoff, anything that comes through the water system goes through our wastewater treatment plants and becomes our tap water, our city tap water. Okay, unless you're on wells, which are also very commonplace, but that's only serving 15% of the US population on average, right? So all of these wastewater treatment plants, and there's 160,000 that serve 85% of the US. So most of us, you could arguably say, are on these wastewater treatment or tap water. Only is covered in terms of the laws to protect us from chemicals, only covers about 91 chemicals under the Safe Drinking Water Act from 1974. That hasn't changed in 50 years, despite the fact that we have so many more chemicals that are being made, manufactured, run off in the water, sewage, whatever. So nothing has changed in that law. And so stuff comes through those treatment plants and then comes right out the other end, pretty much unchanged, except for those 91 chemicals if they, trigger an alarm that they're too high, right? They get remediated. That being said, it also travels a very long distance. My tap water comes from a place that's 30 miles away. So anything, it's added, fluorine is added, a bunch of things are added intentionally, which we need so that we don't have pestilence and end up like 18th century, humans dying. But, we have to kill off infection. But it also can travel through lead piping, PVC piping, breaks in the piping, whatever. So my real commentary is no matter where your water comes from, whether it's a well, for the town or your home or municipal tap water, you have the right, and I feel like a really smart way as an obligation to your body perhaps is to try to think about how to clean it when it hits your home, when it's at the point of use, which is your kitchen sink, right? That's where you get to control. You don't have to worry about all the different things that happen to your water. When it gets to your home, that's where you have the most control. So I started off like everyone else with bottled water when I wasn't sure about water in New Jersey and when we moved in. Then I kind of moved up to say, I don't know, maybe I'll do a pitcher, and didn't know much about it. Then I was using the fridge plus the pitcher, over the years. The technology, though, has gotten so good in terms of cleaning water. The most important type of, I should say, the most aggressive type of water filtration is called reverse osmosis. And the reason I now shout on mountaintops is because the price point has come down so dramatically over 15 years. It used to be $1,000 for one, then 750, then five. I mean, I've been watching the market. They're 275 now for a really reputable reverse osmosis water filter. And then there's different ways to have it. You could have it on the counter, which you have to keep filling up, which I find to be difficult. I tested them all out. And then I had one that was put in by a plumber for $150, literally timed the guy from the second he got to my house to the second he left. Same with my office, because they sometimes will tell you, oh, it's complicated. And then they charge you by the hour and it goes up. So the long story, for 275, 150 for a plumber, for like 400 up front, you now have a system that will probably last you between 5 and 10 years. Change outs for the cartridges are $30 a month. $30 every 6 months, maybe even more. And it's a much actually cheaper system in many ways than a lot of the drop-in pitcher filters that are not as aggressive in terms of the way they clean the water. So, long story short, long answer to your short question is that reverse osmosis is ideal. But I would never poo-poo anyone from using any filtration for their water. And those are carbon block in the fridge or in the pitcher. They're called carbon block. Water goes through very fast for convenience, but that also means it doesn't take off as many contaminants as, say, something that's making water while you sleep through lots of canisters and then ending up in a tank.
And I really appreciated the last section of your book, The Allow, because you tell us all this information, but then you give us lists of foods that you can allow, like 100 different foods, and DIY for different cleaning supplies and recipes. And I think that's really important, so that when you're feeling overwhelmed by reading some of this, you go, okay, I can just look here and know if I'm getting the right, doing the best for my body, my family's bodies. And I think even the medical testing and everything, I really appreciated in the book, because I think that's
I
important
feel
as
like
well.
people have a right to know how to get even testing for heavy metals if you want it from your insurance. Like, why are we paying out of pocket all the time for things that we could really cover in just a couple tests from a primary or a healthcare practitioner who's willing to put the ICD-10 codes? Also the cancer testing, like it always occurs to me that, how much money we spend to get answers. And I myself am a consumer as well. And I just want people to utilize what they're paying for, utilize the system as best you can in the nicest, easiest way. So here, hand this to your doctor, and maybe they'll be willing to order it now that they have all the information they need. Or you could go more extensively to outside labs. So I just want choices available, and, food options available, and recipes available. We're not perfect people. I'm not a purist, I'm a realist. But I do feel that these kind of choices, this kind of information democratizes health in society. Even the most expensive lipstick can be loaded with lead compared to, say, something at Walgreens on the corner. I want people to know that this is how we break through all of this ideas that expensive things are safer. It's just not true.
Dr. Aly Cohen, thank you so much, and congratulations on the launch of Detoxify. We hope that everyone goes out and takes a look at it. We'll have a link in the show
Hold it up
notes.
now.
Yeah, I
Yes,
just
she's
got it
holding-
last. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure, if people are interested, it's just
Yeah.
glossy and
So if
fancy.
you're watching the video, she's holding up the cover.
Yeah, no, I'm really pleased. So it's kind of exciting. So thank you so much for having me, and your audience for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you.